We're a group of GenXers learning about our ADHD and neurodiversity later in life. Join us as we discuss interesting clips we find online and how they relate to our own life experiences. Welcome to This Is How My Brain Works.
Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend us your ears. This is Sarah, and I'm joined today, Sarah Hines, and I'm joined today by Krista Gano, Jason Rudofsky, who we affectionately call Rudy, but sometimes we call him Jason, don't get confused, and Michael Collins. I have the honor of bringing our clip that we're going to view, and it's by a speech therapist. He's a neurodivergent speech therapist named Chris Wenger, and you can find him on Instagram at @speechdude. And also you can DM him the word bananas for epic neuro-affirming tips and strategies. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen.
All right, class, we're going to be talking about the heart and the ventricle. Jackson, you need to sit still during this lesson. A few things to consider in that scenario. You have a student who already has some anxiety, and then when a demand was placed on them and in front of their peers, it activates quickly that nervous system, just like out of nowhere, like a light switch, the fight or flight response. And that may look like this. They might get into that fight response and say something verbally aggressive. They might shove their desk over or push their chair over or throw their Chromebook off their desk. They might go into a flight response and just run out of the class. They might freeze and you ask them to do some work and you're not going to get any work done, and they go into shutdown because what's happened is the nervous system has perceived a threat and they've lost that autonomy and that control. Or they might fawn, they might mask, they might camouflage and suppress all of that. And over time, that causes much more damage. When they get home, it comes out. The families will say, I don't know why things are going so well at school, but at home, it's so much more difficult. So what can we do? All right, class, today we're gonna learn about the heart and the Hey, I see that you have a lot of energy. If you need to grab a fidget while we learn, feel free to go for it. If you need to take a movement break, just let me know. What we did there was use a statement that wasn't a demand, and we added an additional statement that was explicit on what they can do, say they remain in control, their nervous system stays regulated, and everybody wins.
Oh, I see faces. I love this. So I'm going to just start us off because he had something in the comments that struck me as well. He talks about hearing from adults who were forced into mainstream learning and who are even in gifted and talented classes. And they now have autoimmune diseases or mental health difficulties.
What?
Because they've spent their life fawning, and that's such a tax on your nervous system that you sort of it causes long-term damage.
Can you define fawning?
Thank you.
Yes,
Define that.
he listed, sure. He talked about the kind of four, what are now known as the fight or flight responses. We know the fight one, which is the kid turning over the desk maybe, or throwing something, or the flight, running out of the classroom. They've added freeze and fawn. Freeze is when you just shut down and you're like, it's like the shutters come down and you're out of business. Fawn is you're masking the humiliation, the shame you're feeling, and you play like it didn't bother you. Oh, that was funny. And you try to just suppress your upset. And that, for me, I was like, oh, that's me. I was a fawn for sure.
And what, over time, that does something, it actually damages the brain and the nervous system?
I mean, that's one of the comments he has observed. It's anecdotal evidence. I don't know what, kind of double-blind hard science evidence there is for that. But I do, when I read that comment, I felt it in my bones. And I was like, I feel like I can see that in people I know who have potentially neurodivergent.
Because I know that if I was that kid, I would go into that shame space, total embarrassment. I could just feel my body even just heating up and just kind of.
You mean when he came over, when he came over and said that, or just in general?
No, the first one where he like, hey, Jackson, when he's that type of thing.
Johnny, settle down. We're learning.
Yeah, that type of thing. Yeah, going into that that space of feeling that shame, I did something wrong. I could just feel myself starting getting hot and just real embarrassed. And probably I could maybe saying something, trying to kind of like, yeah, mask that with like, no, it's no big deal or whatever. But I also had a tendency to be a smart ass. And I guess that's the fight response.
I think like the smart ass is a combo of fawn and fight.
Yeah.
Like, oh, it's not a big deal. I'm gonna make a joke, but my joke is a little bit like rubbing you, like F you. So it's
Yeah.
both,
Yeah.
I think.
Right.
And I
So I think, yeah, that where that fawning thing resonates is like, especially in grade school, as you get, where people are, now you have grades, and now you can see who's excelling and who's behind, and it's less play, it's less kindergarten stuff, and so that's where I first learned that, like, oh, I'm not keeping up here. I'm not far along in reading, or I'm not able to figure this thing out as quickly, and so already kind of feeling that shame developing, and then yeah, getting called out like that because I can't pay attention for 45 minutes would really then reinforce that there's something wrong with me. So being 54 now and in therapy right now, undoing some of that, letting some of those things heal, it's a very real thing. I mean, I don't, and weirdly, I have, or I guess coincidentally, I do have an autoimmune condition. It's called EOE. It's eosinophilic esophagitis. It's something in your esophagus where you can get food impactions, and it's basically the white blood cells are in there trying to attack something. And so I've had like food sensitivity tests and like, what am I allergic to? All that stuff. And it's defined as a autoimmune disease.
is it related to ARFID at all, which is the like suddenly being unable to swallow something?
No, it isn't that, and it's not like reflux or anything. It's really like just the white blood cells, the eosinophils are attacking something that don't need to be, and it's from like a food sensitivity or sometimes from an allergy. But since I quit drinking a year ago, it's much, much less. But so that can kind of exacerbate it. But it is interesting because at first hearing like, yeah, the fawning and eventually it could create autoimmune, that seemed like a shocking thing. And now it's like, well, I guess it happened to me.
Maybe.
Well,
I mean, like I said, it was just a comment, but when I read the comment, it hit me with how that felt so true.
Wow.
And to hear you having something similar.
Yeah.
Jason?
I don't know. It only makes me think of. It only makes me think of, talking about being called on. There's always this fear of being called on in class.
Yeah.
Just the worry. I think we talked about it. Just the worry of being called on, or the spotlight being on you in that moment. But why
ironically,
then do
from
I
two people
enjoy...
who love the spotlight.
Right.
That's
Because here's the thing. I had this thing last night, and it happens to me before I go on stage always. Even if we're just rehearsing sometimes. It's not debilitating, but there is this very thick sort of nervous fog that comes over my body, like of worry and just wanting to do well. And I've learned over the years to I have a I say some things to myself to help me calm down, and to
What
put
are
me in
some
a
of
good
those
place.
things?
But before, it's called CCT. I'd have to ask my wife honestly about, but I went to an energy woman, who's a wonderful woman, and she gave me these tools to help me in certain situations. Long story. It, you know, I was thinking to myself last night is I so desperately seek the spotlight, can't wait to get on stage, can't wait to entertain people and please people and make people laugh. That's what we want to do. But the feeling right before, and they've talked about athletes having the same thing. Someone plays 20 years, Tom Brady still goes out in the Super Bowl and has these butterflies or whatever you want to call them, and it takes a couple minutes for his body to sort of settle down, into the game. And that's, it's just so interesting that I put my mind and my body through so much angst and stress and nervousness, yet yearned so much for it. Like, I'll put myself through that every single time. And then I thought to myself last night, I'm getting too old for this shit. You know what? I don't need to be like, what do I need to like have these spilkas before I go on stage every time, like making myself so nervous? I'm an old guy. I can't handle this as I used to.
Rudy, a lot of stand-up comics and actors have ADHD, and it is that kind of being maybe insecure about, like, I'm not really performing the way everybody else is. And there is a quote, it's attributed to Judi Dench. She says, acting is the shy person's revenge. So I've thought a lot about that, and I think it's because we don't really like being called on necessarily and being put on the spot, yet if it's on our terms, then we can go out there on stage and get attention and be heard and listened to. Whereas, like, in that type of setting, maybe we're just not, whether it's working memory or I don't know what it would be, like, if we're put on the spot like that, we shy back, or it's just not as comfortable for us.
Maybe that's why maybe that's why the improv came so easily, because we had to think so quickly on our toes as to why we didn't know the answer to something.
But you could live in that class clown impulsive space. That was embraced there. Improv, it's embraced if you can kind of be impulsive and clownish in a character, and
sometimes.
Right. It's not all the time.
I mean, no, I can think of improvisers off a ton of them that we've worked with that, sort of like I had that student once who said, she came through one of the programs in town and she said, they tell me I'm the X factor. And I said, I don't know what that means. Tell me what that means. And she said, it means that you don't know what I'm going to do. And I was like, that was not a compliment.
Right.
This is a team sport.
Sure. Yeah.
So yes, it scratches that itch, but it's also, structured. Improv is very structured,
right.
It really is.
Oh, yes.
So I would love to get back to, because I want to make sure that if there's anybody listening or watching this, that we can have some tips for what happened in that classroom. And this is what I deal with my kiddo all the time. There's a lot of really great stuff coming out right now talking about how the meltdown is not the thing that happened before the meltdown is not the thing that the meltdown is about. So, and this teacher and educators tend to be on the front lines of this type of stuff. So what he did great was he said, I'm going to give you choices. I came over after everybody else is doing something, so no one might even know that I'm talking to you privately. So it was sort of, that whole, like, I'm going to pull you aside. And he gave that kid choices. And for my kid, that matters. There was actually a story, I think it happened like earlier in the year, but there is this actually has made my son and I very angry, and I'll hopefully can get the information to you so we can tag it. But there is a mother in Colorado Springs who has a kiddo who's autistic, who is in a program in a public school because that's the best that they can do often, because most private and charter schools do not want to give services to kids who are on the spectrum or who are managing issues. So that kid had a substitute, was put through a bunch of stuff, totally got flooded, and fled.
Mm.
Right. And that kid, it was a larger kid, middle school, but larger kid. And the resource officer was there and threw that kid up against a wall for not listening to him, and which shut that kid down. Then they put him in a classroom and locked the door, so that the kid couldn't get out until mom came in. No one from the administrators talked. That kid was so scared to leave that classroom, even with his mother, because he thought he was going to jail. And sure enough, they filed a report. And now that mother is, that kid actually is being up on charges. The DA is actually putting him up on charges for assaulting the police officer, for pushing the school resource officer away from him. Yeah, Sarah. Yes, Sarah. Yes. So this
Those listening
16-year-old
at home, Sarah sighed and pulled back angrily.
Sarah, yes, Sarah, I'm sorry, this kid, it was like 16 and does not have a history at all in school of any sort of violence, touching, pushing, none of that. So this is the first, but anyway, so a lot of feelings have come up in me around this, and thinking about how I was so blessed to be in a school where they literally said Cade can leave at any time. Any substitute that came in, I guarantee you, Cade left in the middle of the classroom without addressing that substitute and walked straight to the administrator's office and just sat down for 5 minutes before he went back. That was something that we provided him as an option, because otherwise we were going to have a kid who was going to bang his head against the wall. And, so it's like the meltdown. We can work all day long to make sure there's no meltdowns. Just now, driving my kid between two schools today, something happened. Don't want to say what it is because it's not about that. And it was just sort of like, I just leaned in and said, hey, how do we do this before we take you to the next school? So he was late to school. You just sometimes have to go like, being on time, and that's hard for me, my rigidity, but being on time, doing these things is not as important as just making sure his nervous system stays calm and cool and collected. And then one other thing I just want to say, because when I saw that, Sarah, I saw this quote just today, and that's why I was frantically trying to find it. So this might not be the exact quote, but this is essentially what it was, because I couldn't find it. Was because people say this about me and say this about my kid. You're so high functioning. It's okay. He's high functioning. Right? That's what, and you might hear. Saying that you or your kid is high functioning actually just means that you're good at making others feel comfortable. That hit me, and that really hits, right? So it doesn't mean that, and then there was another person I saw today who's heading up one of these organizations around ADHD and autism awareness, who was saying we have to stop treating ADHD and autism as a disorder to be diagnosed. It is our brains work differently, but it is not an illness. It is not something necessarily that you have to be treated. We feel that way because we were raised in a time where we were high functioning where we were told we have to function to make other people feel comfortable. We weren't given the space for our brains to work the way our brains work. But the truth is that our brains work fine. They just actually don't work in a way that makes teachers in an institutional setting, that makes their lives easy enough.
Well,
because they've got lots of kids. And that's not, and by the way, I want to be clear, that's not a dig on teachers. They have a lot of kids. They've got a lot of things they're dealing with. But so to have a kid like me or my kiddo come through, it's just a bump in their daily road. And the truth is our institutions are not set up for us to be successful just as humans.
No, and they haven't caught up with, the institutions have refused or are just lagging, eons behind.
Haven't been funded.
Haven't been funded, nor do they want to spend the money in developing programs. I mean, they're trying to do the same thing year after year after year, when your students, there is such an increase of, there's such an increase of, students that need special assistance, that need help. in doing things that do not operate by the same grid that we've been operating from, and our institutions have not done anything about it. They just stay on that same track, especially the public institutions, the private institutions. But, you know, like you said early on, they're not going to take kids. They just won't pay. They won't pay for kids to be in their institutions, you know, to have, like we were talking about, one interpreter, right? They're going to pay $60,000, $70,000 for one interpreter. They'll find any way to not have that student at their school. It happens in the public institutions too. It's sad, but they're just not up to. They're not up to. They're not up to the same level that our children are right now at all. They don't know how to handle it.
Yeah. I think we're getting close to time.
I have that we have 5 more minutes before I give a 5-minute warning.
Oh, wow. I guess I wasn't paying close attention.
This
Good.
is your 5-minute,
I wanna-
5-minute warning.
This is
Good,
your
then I have-
5-minute warning. Sorry.
Well, you know me, I've got a big topic.
I know.
So the fact
There
that
we go. That yeah, maybe I'm just starting to plan for the Sarah Hines factor.
Okay. Or I am. I'm ready. I'm like, we've got 10. That means I have 5. So there's a comment on this by Claire Lewis Art, and I just really liked the comment. She's like, this is true. Class size is usually 30 or more. This exception of letting the kids have the fidget toys, I'm thinking she means, then creates more realizations within that classroom. And then there's an increase in behaviors that start to unmask needs and expectations increase. She then goes on to say that a quiet listening class isn't possible and learning is limited. Are we expecting too much of our teachers? And, you know, she goes on to say, is there a way we can make this learning more inclusive using practicals and visuals perhaps? And of course, planning extra learning from the curricular set, slides, works, handout. It's tough being a teacher when resources and extra staff are no longer available. And what I would say,
Oh, I got to push back to that.
I know there, but I think that she raises a really valid point.
Kind of.
Yeah, well, wait till I say what I think is valid, and then you might agree with me. But what I notice is the really important part she said is then others can unmask too. And I think this gets to the kids who aren't identified as needing assistance, but probably or maybe do, or are high functioning, but could benefit from it. And so while what she's saying is it's impossible to implement, maybe is kind of part of the takeaway because it's just one teacher with 30 kids. What I would say is actually then it becomes easier if you lean into it and you're not afraid. If your belief is that they're all capable learners and you hold fast to that value, then you can get each of those kids to start to settle down within the environment and you're going to get moving together forward faster. And so when, for example, little Johnny is acting up and he gets up to get a fidget toy and Sarah, me sitting on the other side, is also feeling all this stuff, but is masking it. I see Johnny do that. I then go and get a fidget toy and the two of us start kind of doing our thing. Well, if you just let it run its course, then we do come back in and likely have been listening to everything that was being said while we're doing this craziness and have that sort of ability to synthesize everything that just happened and bring the whole class forward. I just sat in the IEP meeting and I'm sorry, my little kid. I have three kids, so it's one of them, you don't know. But the teacher basically said, if the kid is required to read anything or be tested on it, they're going to come in with comprehension at the 50% level, where everyone else is expected to be 75 or higher to pass. If you ask my kid, they're going to be answering at well above grade level because that's how their brain works. And then they complimented my kid, and this is where the fawn, I think, is coming through for them, because my kid apparently has an exceptional sense of humor well above their peers that often only the teacher gets the joke. And gets me back to what you were saying, Michael, with being the class clown. I think the class clown is, it's coming from this place of, I don't know what's really going on, but I do know this stuff. And I know that I can make this joke and tie in.
Yeah.
And when teachers can harness that, they can actually bring the whole class along too. And it becomes a teachable moment for both the neurotypicals and the kids who are maybe on a different spectrum. Krista, you want to push back?
Well, I was just going to say, I think that you guys have heard me say this, and I'll say it again and again. It's like, you're going to spend the time and the effort, and you're going to have the chaos, whether you like it or not. So you can either, this idea, because I heard that too. It's like, well, if we give permission here, we're going to have everybody who's gotten permission to do something special. And then I'm not going to be able to manage the classroom. And it's like, I'm going to tell you right now, with my kid, you will not be able to manage the classroom with one kid who you're not working with to let his brain have some ease, because he will create a problem in the classroom. So my, I guess, pushback on some of that is this narrative of like, well, are we expecting too much of teachers? Well, I don't think so. I think it is about being able to say, I'm going to look at something a little bit differently for these kids. It doesn't take a lot. For the moment that they looked at Cade and said, you're allowed to, when you are about to feel like you're about to be disruptive, you're allowed to have 5 minutes to walk around. This is a contract. You can have 5 minutes to walk around and come back in and ease your brain. But that means that you have to do it. We can't find you doing bad stuff. We can't have you disrupting another classroom. You have to do what you say. So it was a contract that they made with him. The moment that happened, zero problems from then on. And I'm talking zero problems from then on. I'm talking a kid who was about to throw furniture, a kid who was crying, screaming, a kid who was, all of the stuff turned into zero, because they said, when you feel like you're dysregulated, here's an option for you that's not going to mess with the other kids, that's going to let you have a moment alone. And that doesn't have to look like walking around. It could look like having a space in the corner of the classroom that everyone knows when so-and-so is in that space. Like, there are creative solutions to this that I promise you will make the teachers may roll not all of them. Some teachers may roll their eyes about doing it, feel like they can't do it. I promise you, it makes your classroom easier to manage when you treat these kids as if they are creative, resourceful, and whole, and that they know their bodies better than you. Period.
Right. And you know what? It's not like it used to be. That's the point. They have not made this transition. It's not like when we were in school and they just taught it one way. That's the way it was. There was they were making no concessions for anyone else in the classroom. I don't remember there being, anyone being set aside or doing, I don't remember. I mean, I remember we had a gifted and talented, situation in our school, and we were allowed to do Dungeons and Dragons. But as far as I'm concerned, each kid now, it seems, could be on an IEP, an individualized education program. Each child can be educated completely different, because that's how their brain works. And it's no cliche anymore, but that's the truth. Kids' brains have changed so much over the last several, generations, I think, that, and it's all
with smartphones.
There it is, of course, that you can't have the same teaching style that you did 20 years ago. It's not going to work, because the brains have changed so much. And, it's very difficult for kids these days to sit around for an hour.
Although I would tell you, I would argue that that's not necessarily true. You look at schools in France, and in France, they're taking 2-hour lunches. They eat fresh food for lunch.
Of course.
But those kids, they're testing higher than our kids.
Of course they are. The United States is completely messed up, but we don't value education. We don't value education in our children. And it's just a business. It's simply a business. And they're just doing it the same way they keep doing it. They don't, and I mean, I say they, but.
And let's be clear, during COVID, when my kids were at home, they were done with their actual work by like usually 11 a.m. Like all
Ready
of the
at
work was done. And the rest of the time is really about like learning how to move around in lines. And I'm sorry, and this sounds like I'm trashing education. I'm really not. I've got my
There's
sister's
so
a
many
teacher.
good teachers.
There's
Yeah.
so many, and there's
No,
so
of
many,
course there are.
listen,
Of
there's
course
so
there
many
are, but
good
they're
things.
strapped too.
But there's also some stuff that I think they would agree could be done
Of
differently.
course, yes.
Michael, any last thoughts before we sign off?
No, I mean,
Call on Michael and put him right on the spot.
He's
Yeah,
got
put me on the
youngins,
spot.
so he's
Wrap
like,
it
he's
up,
got young
Michael.
ones.
let me flee. I'm gonna flight.
I thought you were gonna fawn. You
Oh.
promised that you would fawn.
Yeah, totally, guys. I'm totally with what you're saying. So clearly. No, I just wonder what education is going to be like here, by the time my son who's 10 gets, into, high school, and after what college, what that experience will be like. It's much different. But I think, because my son, they have had the fidget thing in their classrooms, and some things have been tried and then discontinued, or, from chewing gum to the fidgets to the different types of seats. And so I think with his school, it's a charter school where they're trying to kind of implement some of this or be open to some of this. And, I'll go into a classroom and it seems kind of chaotic, but like there's collaboration going on and there are things getting done, and it's very interesting. So, it's a much different experience than when I was in school and was expected to sit in that wooden chair, that wooden desk for that amount of time.
Do you know a tote tray?
Torture.
Remember, did you have a tote tray?
Tote tray. We had the desk thing that opened up. We had
Oh no, we had a
was-
tote tray. That you then put in like a cabinet, put
yeah.
your name on it.
Oh yeah.
But
Like,
anyway-
it was like it was my first like sort of it was like being a busser.
Sure.
It was like a bus tray, and you just put your crayons and stuff, and you had to put it up into a thing.
Yeah.
And that is our Gen X moment of this episode.
Yes.
Tote tray by Milton Bradley. No.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that was
Right, we got it.
good clips, Sarah. That was very interesting.
Yeah. So again, that was Chris Wenger, the speech dude he's a neurodivergent speech
Wenger.
therapist. Not a wanker.
Wenger.
Wenger. Wenger. And thank you for joining us. I hope this was helpful for you and get you a fidget spinner.
Fidget on. If you like this episode of This Is How My Brain Works, please like, subscribe, and share. For more info on today's clip, the hosts, and our podcast, check out the show notes. Thanks for listening.